There's a story that circulates in certain corners of the internet, whispered in forums and dropped into comment sections like a secret nobody dares say out loud. It goes something like this. Somewhere buried in the earliest layers of the book of Genesis, there existed a chapter that told us the truth. A chapter that admitted plainly that when the first humans arrived on the scene, they weren't actually first. That there was already a world out there, populated, moving, breathing, long before Adam ever opened his eyes in a garden. And then, so the story goes, that chapter was removed, cut out, buried by scribes who couldn't bear to let that secret stand in the sacred text. A forbidden chapter, erased from Genesis, hiding a world Genesis refuses to explain. It's a good story. It's the kind of story that sticks in your mind at 2 a.m. when the house is quiet and your thoughts start wandering into places they don't usually go. But here's the thing we're going to do tonight. We're not going to tell you that story is true. We're also not going to tell you it's simply false and leave it at that. Because the real answer sitting underneath this legend is stranger than the legend itself, and far more defensible than a simple tale about a missing chapter ever could be. Tonight we're going to sit with the actual evidence. Not the campfire version, not the conspiracy version, but the version that comes from Dead Sea Scrolls fragments, from ancient Greek translations made centuries before Christ, from a list of scribal corrections that rabbis themselves openly admitted to making, and from a handful of verses in Genesis so strange, so grammatically unusual, that scholars have been quietly arguing about them for over a century. We're going to look at a plural word spoken by God in the first chapter of Genesis. We're going to look at a verse in Deuteronomy that exists in 4 different forms depending on which ancient manuscript you happen to be holding. We're going to look at a man, Cain, who commits the first murder in the Bible and then turns around afraid that some unnamed someone out there in the world is going to kill him in return. And we're going to ask calmly, without any need to rush toward an answer, what that fear might be telling us about a world Genesis never quite explains. Before we go further, if you're listening to this while you're falling asleep or driving somewhere quiet, or just lying in the dark, letting your mind drift, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is right now. I read these comments more than you'd think. Someone in Lisbon at midnight, someone in Manila just waking up, someone in a small town in Ohio on their lunch break. It's a strange, wonderful thing, all these different time zones converging on the same quiet story. So leave a comment if you feel like it. And if you want to support what we're doing here without spending a cent, the best way is simply to follow this show on Spotify. There's a link in the description below. It costs nothing. It takes about 3 seconds and it genuinely helps keep this going. So here's what we're going to walk through tonight. Slowly, one piece at a time. The chapter that supposedly vanished and why that particular claim doesn't hold up under scrutiny. What the actual ancient witnesses, the scrolls, the translations, the manuscripts actually agree on. A stranger, narrower truth hiding underneath the myth. The single strangest paragraph in the entire book of Genesis. A word scholars have called a torso, a fragment of something larger. A verse that shapeshifts depending on which ancient copy you read. A list of corrections Judaism itself has kept on record for 2,000 years, and a 17th century Frenchman who nearly lost his freedom for asking the very question we're asking tonight. No rushing, no easy answers, just the evidence, laid out calmly, exactly as it survives. Let's start with the plainest fact available to us, the fact that doesn't require any interpretation, any hedging, any careful scholarly qualification. There is no missing chapter of Genesis, not in any manuscript, not in any fragment, not in any translation, not anywhere. This isn't a matter of opinion, it's a matter of what has actually survived physically in libraries and caves and monasteries around the world. When we talk about the text of Genesis, We're not talking about a single document that somebody could have quietly edited in secret. We're talking about multiple independent witnesses copied by different communities in different languages in different centuries, often by people who had no contact with each other and no reason to coordinate a cover-up even if they'd wanted to. Consider what we actually have. There's the Masoretic text, the version preserved by Jewish scribes and used as the basis for most Hebrew Bibles today, carefully copied and recopied with an almost obsessive attention to accuracy, letter by letter, generation after generation. There's the Samaritan Pentateuch, a separate tradition maintained by the Samaritan community, diverging from the Masoretic text in hundreds of small ways. But following the same basic structure, there's the Septuagint, the Greek translation made by Jewish scholars in Alexandria centuries before the birth of Christ, giving us a window into how Genesis read in Greek long before Christianity even existed. And there are the Qumran fragments, the pieces of Genesis found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, physical documents over 2,000 years old, pulled out of caves in the Judean desert in the mid-20th century, untouched by human hands for 2 millennia, until they were rediscovered. 4 separate witnesses, 4 separate transmission histories. And when scholars line them up side by side, chapter by chapter, story by story, they tell fundamentally the same tale. Creation, the garden, the expulsion, the genealogies, the flood, the tower, the patriarchs. 50 chapters, in the shape we recognize today, the same basic sequence of events from Adam to the death of Joseph in Egypt. There are differences between these witnesses, real differences, some of them quite interesting, and we're going to spend time on a few of the most significant ones later tonight. But none of those differences amount to an entire missing chapter. None of them show a gap where a section should be, a scar where something has been cut away. If a chapter had been removed from Genesis in antiquity, we would expect to see at least some trace of it somewhere, in at least one of these independent traditions. We don't. Now, here's where the story gets a little more interesting, because there's a detail that gets misunderstood constantly, and once you understand it, the whole idea of a missing chapter starts to look less like ancient conspiracy and more like a simple mix-up about how books actually work. When people imagine a chapter being cut from Genesis, they're usually imagining something like a numbered section, chapter such and such, sliced cleanly out of the book the way you might tear a page from a modern paperback. But the chapter numbers we use today, Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 6, Genesis chapter 50, those numbers didn't exist when Genesis was written. They didn't exist for most of Genesis's history at all. The ancient Hebrew text had no chapter divisions the way we think of them now. It was written as continuous text, sometimes broken into paragraph units for liturgical reading, but without the numbered chapter structure that lets a modern reader flip to a specific spot in seconds. The chapter divisions familiar to us today, the ones printed in nearly every Bible on every shelf in every language, were introduced by a man named Stephen Langton, an English theologian working in Paris around the year 1200. Langton later became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's remembered for a lot of things, including his role in the events surrounding the Magna Carta. But one of his quieter, more practical contributions was this system of chapter numbering, developed to help students and scholars navigate the text of the Bible more easily. Before Langton, if you wanted to reference a particular passage, you had to describe it, quote a line from it, point to it by name. After Langton, you could simply say chapter 6, verse 1, and everyone using his system would land on the same spot. This system spread. It was adopted into Hebrew Bibles, into Latin Bibles, into every major translation that followed, and it's the system still used today, over 800 years later. But it's a medieval invention laid on top of an ancient text. It has nothing to do with how the original authors or editors of Genesis organized their material. So when someone claims that a chapter was cut from Genesis, cut out and hidden by ancient scribes, trying to protect a secret, There's a quiet problem sitting right at the centre of that claim. A problem that has nothing to do with theology and everything to do with basic chronology. The chapter structure being described didn't exist yet. There was no chapter 6 to remove a piece from, no chapter 50 to renumber afterward. The scribes copying Genesis 1,000 years before Stephen Langton was born weren't working with chapters at all. Asking whether a chapter was cut from Genesis is a little like asking which page number was missing from a scroll, when scrolls didn't have page numbers to begin with. It's not that the question is offensive or forbidden. It's that the question, as usually phrased, doesn't quite fit the object it's being asked about. This doesn't mean nothing strange is going on in the text of Genesis. It means the strangeness isn't shaped like a missing chapter. It's shaped like something else entirely, something we're going to spend the rest of this evening carefully unfolding. In textual criticism, each of those 4 streams we just named has a very simple, almost humble title. It's called a witness, not because it can stand up in court and testify, but because it bears witness to how the text looked at a particular time and in a particular community. The Masoretic text is a witness. The Samaritan Pentateuch is a witness. The Septuagint is a witness. The Qumran fragments are witnesses. None of them is a security camera recording from the moment Genesis was written. They are all copies of copies, shaped by scribes with their own habits, their own traditions, their own mistakes and corrections. But they are separate enough from each other that when they agree on something, especially on something large and structural, that agreement starts to matter in a very specific way. Imagine 4 people describing a building they've each visited. One speaks Hebrew, one Greek, one Samaritan Aramaic, one some local dialect from the desert. They don't agree on the paint colour in the lobby. One is sure there were 3 steps at the entrance, another swears there were 4. One remembers a window that the others never mention. You'd expect that. Human memory is messy. Human copying is messy. But if all 4 say the building has 10 floors, not 9, not 11, 10, and if all 4 describe the same basic layout of those floors in the same order, you would probably start to trust them on the number of floors. That is more or less what happens with Genesis. These witnesses disagree on details that live inside the chapters. A word here, a phrase there, a verse moved or missing, a genealogical number nudged up or down. The Septuagint sometimes has a slightly longer reading, the Masoretic sometimes a shorter one. The Samaritan tradition occasionally smooths something awkward. The Qumran fragments, where they overlap, can match any of the above or preserve a wording that is otherwise lost. But step back from the level of individual words and look at the skeleton. The witnesses all present the same sequence of narratives, the same broad architecture of the book: creation, garden, exile, Cain and Abel, genealogies, flood, more genealogies, Babel, Abram, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Different wording in places, different emphases here and there. But the same backbone. For a textual critic, that kind of high-level agreement is not a minor detail. It is the sort of thing that lets you rule certain scenarios out, or at least push them into the realm of very low probability. If there had once been a chapter of Genesis that told a whole additional story on the scale of, say, the flood or the Tower of Babel, and if it had been deliberately removed, you would need that removal to have happened before these traditions diverged, which would mean the cut would have to be older than the oldest layer represented in any of them. At that point, it is very hard to keep calling it a chapter of Genesis in the way we usually mean the word, because now we are talking about prehistory, about sources and drafts behind the book, rather than something carved out of the book itself. And if the hypothetical cut were more recent, if someone in one community or one language group had decided to excise a big, self-contained narrative late in the process, you would expect the other witnesses not to cooperate. You'd expect at least one manuscript line somewhere to preserve a trace. An extra narrative unit, a reference that no longer seems to have a referent, an odd break in the flow where a known older tradition used to stand. You would expect misalignment at the level of structure. But when we line up the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, and the Qumran fragments, the flaws all stack. This is why scholars who work with these materials generally do not talk about a lost chapter of Genesis. They talk instead about something subtler, and in many ways more interesting. They talk about internal variation within shared boundaries. They talk about pluses and minuses that affect clauses and verses, not whole blocks of narrative that wander in and out. They talk about alternative readings of the same line, not alternative episodes sitting between the lines. It is important here to make a distinction that often gets blurred in popular conversations. One question is the chapter structure of modern Bibles complete? On that, the four major witnesses are effectively in lockstep. Another, very different question is, within those chapters, has the text been edited, smoothed, or adjusted? On that, the witnesses give us plenty to talk about. We find verses whose wording is unstable. We find parallel passages that match in one tradition and diverge in another. We find what look like expansions, clarifications, and sometimes theological tweaks. The material is anything but pristine. So the agreement across witnesses does not mean Genesis came down from the sky in a single perfect form and has been frozen ever since. It means that at the scale of whole narrative units, the story as we have it is already very old and very stable across independent lines of transmission. The disagreements live inside that frame, not outside it. This is why the forbidden chapter language, while dramatic, tends to misdirect our curiosity. It points us toward imagining a missing slab of text, a clean break where somebody took a knife to the scroll. The witnesses we actually have suggest a different picture. They suggest a text whose broad outline has been very secure for a long time, but whose interior has been worked on, commented on, and in some places quietly reshaped. In other words, if you're looking for secrets, the interesting ones are not hiding in a big chapter-sized hole. They are hiding in the seams, in the overlaps, in the places where the witnesses almost agree but not quite. They are in the variants, in the odd phrases that one tradition changes and another preserves, in the verses that show signs of having been massaged to fit later theology or later liturgical practice. And far from being a dead end, this kind of agreement is what makes that search possible. Because the witnesses concur on the overall frame, we can notice when something inside that frame looks out of place. Because they give us a stable outline, we can pay attention to the small edits and quiet gaps that do exist. The question stops being what chapter was cut out, and becomes what pressures shape the text we actually have, and where can we still see their fingerprints. That is the path we are going to follow. Not chasing a phantom chapter that all the major traditions somehow forgot, but listening closely to the witnesses we do have, and asking what their agreements and disagreements suggest about how Genesis grew, what it left unsaid, and why some parts of the world it hints at never quite made it into the stories we know. So, if there is no clean, chapter-sized whole, what is left? When you strip away the fantasy of a whole slab of Genesis, lying in some Vatican vault, four narrower, more stubbornly real things are still sitting in the text and in its history, waiting to be dealt with. The first is that Genesis, as we have it, shows signs of visible editing. Not just the sort of benign copying errors that all manuscripts collect, but passages that feel layered, seams that do not quite disappear when you run your fingers over them, verses that look like they have been trimmed or expanded or redirected. Modern scholarship does not agree on every example, but there is wide recognition that Genesis is not a single, unbroken stream of prose. It reads more like a river that has braided and rebraided over time, with older channels still faintly visible under the current one. The second is what some commentators have called a torso-like passage, a piece of text that looks like the surviving trunk of something larger. It has shoulders and a rib cage, and maybe the start of a neck, but the head and limbs are gone. It starts too abruptly, ends too suddenly, and raises more questions than it answers. You do not need to be a specialist to feel this. You only need to read slowly enough to notice when a story seems to be referencing a context that has not been given. The third is that Genesis occasionally gestures at a world that is already populated, already complicated, before the narrative has told us how it got that way. It moves from two people in a garden to a man afraid of being killed by unnamed others, from a first family to a city, to wandering and intermarriage and violence that presuppose more than a single nuclear household. The book does not pause to fill those gaps. It simply moves on, as if some background knowledge is being assumed. And the fourth is not in Genesis itself, but in early modern Europe. A book that took these hints and tried to read them literally as proof of another humanity before Adam. A book that was actually printed, distributed, denounced, burned, and forcibly withdrawn. Not a lost chapter of the Bible, but a very real chapter in the history of how people have tried to imagine what might lie behind the silences in Genesis. Those four things together are less dramatic than a secret scroll cut out of existence. They are also, in many ways, more interesting. They are not about a single act of censorship that we could, in theory, undo by finding the missing piece. They are about long processes, layers of composition, habits of copying, theological anxieties, philosophical experiments. They invite slower questions. What kinds of edits are visible? What kind of story fragment could survive as a torso? What sort of world is implied by the narrative's casual references to other people and other cities? What happens when someone tries to take those implications to their logical extreme and publish the result? To follow those questions, we are going to take several threads one by one, and each of them will pull on a different part of this narrower, stranger truth. One thread runs straight through what is arguably the most puzzling little block of narrative in the entire book, Genesis 6:1-4. It is only a few verses long, but it reads like we have walked into the middle of a conversation. It introduces figures that are never fully explained, offers a compressed explanation for something about the human condition, and then is abruptly followed by the flood story. Scholars have called it a torso for a reason. It looks like part of a tradition that at some stage was either shortened or only partially included. We will look at how that passage functions inside Genesis as we have it, and what, if anything, can be said about the larger ideas it might be echoing. A second thread is not about odd content, but about visible variation. Deuteronomy 32:8, a verse outside Genesis, but deeply connected to how the Bible imagines the structure of the world, survives in clearly different forms in our witnesses. One tradition speaks of sons of Israel, another of sons of God, and the Qumran material preserves yet another phrasing. This is not a hypothetical reconstruction. It is a place where the manuscripts in our hands do not agree. Looking closely at that disagreement lets us see how theological pressure, scribal habits, and inherited mythic language could interact on a single line of text. A third thread concerns not accidental variation, but deliberate correction. Within the Jewish Scribal tradition, there is a small, defined set of places where the scribes themselves said, in effect, "This is not how the verse originally read, but we are copying it this way now." These are called the Tiqqune Sopherim, the scribal emendations. However we evaluate each item on that list, the very existence of such a list tells us something about how later readers perceived the text, where they felt discomfort, and how they believed it should be handled. It is a rare case where the people doing the copying leave us a marginal note about their own interventions. Yet another thread stays within Genesis 1:4, and simply refuses to look away from the oddities most of us glide past. the unexplained plurals in "Let us make humankind in our image," the man has become like one of us, and the sudden appearance of a world beyond Eden that already contains people who might kill Cain, women for him to marry, and a city for him to build. Taken together, these are not proof of a missing chapter, but they are consistent with a text that assumes a larger imaginative landscape than it chooses to narrate. Paying attention to them will help us see how Genesis both reveals and conceals the world it presupposes. And finally, we will circle back to that burned book. In the 17th century, Isaac Le Peyrère read many of the same odd details we have just named, and drew a conclusion that most of his contemporaries found intolerable. He argued that there had been human beings before Adam, that Genesis was telling the story of only one particular line within a broader humanity, and that this had implications for theology, for history, and for the status of different peoples. His book, Prae-Adamitae, was publicly condemned and destroyed in some cities. His case will give us a concrete example of how far one reader could go when he treated the gaps and gestures in Genesis as literal clues rather than as literary shadows. None of these threads taken by itself unlocks a clean alternative version of Genesis. They do not converge on a single lost chapter that we could neatly reinsert between existing verses. But together they sketch a more modest, and in some ways stranger, picture. A book whose outlines have been stable for a very long time, but whose interior still shows the marks of earlier traditions, later corrections, and unresolved tensions. A text that occasionally looks sideways at a larger world it never fully describes, and a history of readers and scribes who have tried, each in their own way, to decide how much of that larger world could be allowed to remain visible on the page. When you finally reach Genesis 6, the text slows down for a moment just before the flood, and then, almost without warning, it drops 4 verses that feel like they wandered in from somewhere else. When human beings began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, it says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were good, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty ones who were of old, men of name." That is the entire passage. 4 verses. No introduction, no explanation, no return to the subject afterward. The next line moves straight to, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth," and the story shifts into the familiar account of the flood. If you listen to those 4 verses slowly, the oddity of their shape starts to emerge. The opening line sounds like we are joining a story already underway. When human beings began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them. There is no explicit link to what came just before. We are not told, after the line of Seth developed or after the generations listed above, the phrase "began to multiply" echoes the blessing from earlier chapters, but the effect is more like a vague timestamp than a narrative hook. The verse feels as if it expects you to know what phase of human history this is, and why the appearance of daughters sets up a problem. Then come the sons of God. The text gives no definition. It does not pause to identify them as angels, or members of a heavenly council, or simply noble human lineages. It simply assumes that sons of God is a category the reader will recognize, a group who see that human women are good and take them as wives. The verbs are blunt and familiar from earlier episodes: seeing, desiring, taking. It is the pattern from the garden replayed on a larger scale, but with actors who have never previously appeared in the book. Before we are allowed to sit with that, the perspective shifts. God reacts. "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. There is no explicit mention of children from these unions yet, no spelled-out accusation about what has gone wrong. The divine speech sounds like a compressed verdict on human lifespan, or perhaps on human arrogance, yet it is tacked onto a scene whose meaning has not been made fully clear. Even the 120 years is puzzling, because Genesis itself goes on to describe people living longer than that in the chapters that follow. Then, as if remembering something that ought not to be left out, the text adds another line. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. These Nephilim are not introduced as if they were new. The tone is almost casual, as though they were already a familiar piece of the world's furniture. The narrator only explains that they were present when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and that the offspring of those unions were the mighty ones, famous warriors from the distant past. If this were the core of a story, this is the point at which you would expect elaboration. Who exactly are the sons of God? How do their children differ from other humans? Why does this provoke a divine decision about human longevity? What role do these mighty men play in the growing violence that leads to the flood? Instead, the thread is dropped. The flood narrative does not name them again. Later genealogies do not trace them. The laws of Moses do not mention them as a category. Even when Nephilim reappears in numbers in the fearful report of the spies, the tone is nostalgic and elusive, as if invoking a legend already known, rather than reporting on characters the Torah has carefully developed. Readers have been uneasy with this little block of text for a very long time. Ancient translators already disagree on how to render sons of God. Some go for angels. Some paraphrase in more generic terms. Early Jewish and Christian interpreters produced competing explanations, some of which grew into elaborate mythologies in their own right. Medieval commentators sometimes tried to domesticate the passage, reading sons of God as noble men and daughters of men as commoners, as if the problem were merely social mixing. Others took the language at face value and struggled with what it might mean for the boundaries between heaven and earth. Modern scholars are not much more settled. Some treat Genesis 6:1-4 as a remnant of an older myth about semi-divine heroes, awkwardly trimmed down and left in place because it had become part of the tradition. Others see it as a crafted preface to the flood, a way of saying that human corruption had reached even into cosmic spheres. Some think the 120 years is a general limit on the human lifespan. Others hear it as a countdown to the deluge. There are discussions about whether Nephilim originally meant fallen ones, giants, or something else entirely, each option carrying different implications. None of these readings commands universal agreement. What most of them do share is a sense that the passage does not quite feel whole. It begins as if some prior explanation has already been given. It moves through a chain of images and decisions that are only half spelled out. It ends with a reference to famous figures of old that it never takes the time to narrate. The logical joints are there, but they are underdeveloped, like a sketch that has been inked around the edges while the interior remains lightly penciled in. This is the quality that led some commentators to call Genesis 6:1-4 a torso. It is not that we can point to a specific fuller version sitting in another text and say, here is what must once have been there. For this passage we cannot. It is that, when you read these verses on their own terms inside Genesis as it stands, they look like the preserved middle of a story that had more to it than the 4 sentences we now have. The shoulders and rib cage remain, but the head and limbs are missing. For our purposes, that sense of incompleteness is more important than any particular reconstruction. It suggests that we are not just dealing with a difficult idea, but with a fragmentary one. The shape of the text itself hints that something about its boundaries has shifted. Later, when we look at how form critics have tried to describe this shape, and how redaction critics have tried to place it in the book's composition, That intuition of a torso will become one of the main clues they work with. When Hermann Gunkel picked up these 4 verses, he did not treat them as a puzzle to be solved once and for all. He approached them the way a form critic approaches a misshapen poem in an old anthology. He listened for echoes, for repeated patterns, for the way the lines breathe. And what he heard in Genesis 6:1-4, he famously summed up in a stark phrase. For him this was nothing but a torso in Gunkel's usage. That is not an insult. It is a diagnosis. When he calls a passage a torso, he is not saying it is worthless. He is saying it looks like the surviving middle of something that used to be larger and more articulate. In the same way that a sculptor's fragment can preserve the curve of a rib cage without giving you the head or the feet, Gunkel thought these verses preserved the core of an older story without preserving its full narrative frame. For Gunkel, this did not come from a feeling of strangeness alone. He tried to map Genesis 6:1-4 onto other short mythic reports from the ancient Near East. Little notices about semi-divine heroes and ancestral warriors. He saw a pattern in which stories about extraordinary figures were sometimes condensed into bare notices, a list of names, a brief remark that they were mighty men of old, a nod to their reputation without the adventures that made them famous. In his judgment, Genesis 6 reads like that kind of condensation. It gestures toward a world in which sons of God and mighty men were meaningful categories, while no longer telling the saga that would have made that meaning obvious. So when Gunkel calls the passage a torso, he is naming a particular kind of incompleteness. It is not that there must have been a missing verse right before it on the page, or that we can go to some archive and recover a lost paragraph that originally stood between verse 3 and verse 4. We do not have that sort of material evidence. Instead, he is saying that, as a form, as a unit of storytelling, this text behaves like a middle that has lost its beginning and its end. The fragment that remains is coherent enough to be read, but not complete enough to answer the questions it raises. A later commentator, Claus Westermann, looked at the same verses and heard something slightly different. Where Gunkel emphasized the brokenness of the story, Westermann drew attention to a more stable element inside it. He argued that within this little block there is what he called a fixed formula, a piece of conventional wording that did not originate with the final author of Genesis, but came from an earlier layer of tradition. For Westermann, that formula is bound up with the sequence sons of God taking daughters of men, followed by the divine verdict about human days. The exact boundaries of the formula can be debated, and Westermann himself was cautious, but in broad terms he thought that the combination of those motifs and their relatively compact wording pointed to an inherited unit. In his view, an older, already shaped saying about a time when heavenly beings crossed a boundary, and when God responded with a limitation had been taken over and fitted into the larger pre-flood narrative. When form critics and source critics pick up this suggestion, they treat it as one more clue that Genesis 6:1-4 is not a fresh composition invented all at once by a single hand. Instead, they imagine layers. At one layer there may have been a proverb-like report about mighty men of old, or a stock formula about divine beings mingling with mortals and provoking a shortening of human days. At another layer, someone stitched that traditional wording into the emerging story of the flood, perhaps trimming it, perhaps smoothing a transition, perhaps leaving it slightly rough where it did not fully mesh. In that kind of reconstruction, Gunkel's torso and Westermann's fixed formula fit together. The torso is the larger sense that we have only the trunk of an older mythic narrative. The fixed formula is the inner core of that trunk, the hard phrase or motif that earlier storytellers had already crystallized, and that later editors were reluctant to discard. The compression that makes the passage feel abrupt is then read as the result of this process. A more expansive narrative about divine beings, human women, hybrid offspring, and a changed world may once have been told in full. What remains in Genesis is, on this reading, a brief traditional kernel embedded in a new context. Source-critical scholars tend to build on this by mapping other parts of Genesis in similar ways. They point out that certain phrases and narrative patterns recur in multiple places, suggesting an oral or written stock of formulas that different authors and editors drew on. Where those recurring patterns appear most densely, they infer an earlier version or a shared source. Where the flow of the story becomes jagged, or where a formula seems to sit awkwardly in its surroundings, they infer editing decisions, compressions and compromises. It is important, though, to notice what kind of evidence this is, and what it is not. Neither Gunkel's torso nor Westermann's fixed formula is a physical object. We do not have a longer parallel scroll of Genesis 6 that we can lay side by side with the Masoretic text and mark up with red pen. We do not possess an ancient tablet that spells out a complete saga of the sons of God and their famous descendants, and then pauses to note, a shortened version of this story was later inserted into the Hebrew flood narrative. What we have are patterns in the wording and in the way the short unit sits inside its current literary environment. Gunkel's language of a torso is a way of describing that pattern. Westermann's talk of a fixed formula is another way of describing it. Both are acts of literary judgment. They arise from long familiarity with biblical style and with comparable material from the ancient world. They are not arbitrary, but they are also not the same as finding pages torn out of a codex. So when these scholars speak of missing beginnings or compressed traditions, they are not claiming that a scribe literally cut a chapter out of Genesis and threw it away. They are offering a model of how the text as we have it might have been assembled over time from older pieces, some kept in full, some preserved only as torso and formula. Other scholars question parts of this model or prefer different reconstructions, or warn against pressing the language of fragments too hard. The common ground is more modest. It is the recognition that Genesis 6:1-4 does not behave like a freshly composed, fully explained episode. It carries the feel of inherited material that has been adapted, compressed, and left slightly opaque, preserving just enough of an older world of meaning to remind us that we are not hearing the whole story. If we stay with Gunkel's image of a torso and Westermann's sense of a fixed formula, it can be tempting to reach for a very particular kind of solution. If this feels like the middle of a larger story, the mind immediately wants to know where the rest of the story went. In modern discussions, that longing often turns toward later literature. People ask whether the Book of Enoch, or some other Second Temple writing, might be preserving the original version of what Genesis has only kept in miniature. Here it is worth pausing and naming something that is surprisingly close to a consensus in recent scholarship. Over roughly the last half-century, most specialists have come to think that the dependence runs the other way. They would say that the elaborate narratives about rebellious angels and their offspring in later texts are developments built on Genesis 6:1-4, not surviving witnesses to a lost, fuller Genesis. In this view, Genesis stands as the older, more compressed kernel, and texts like 1 Enoch represent later attempts to expand, interpret, and moralize that kernel for new audiences and new concerns. That judgment rests on a cluster of considerations. The language and style of Genesis 6 fit comfortably with its context in the primeval history, whereas the later accounts make heavy use of themes, terms, and concerns that are characteristic of much later periods. The Jewish literature that clearly knows both Genesis and those expanded stories tends to quote or allude to Genesis as the anchor text, and then to treat the more detailed narratives as commentary or elaboration. When scholars trace the reception history, they usually see a pattern in which a brief and enigmatic notice at the start of the flood story becomes a seedbed for increasingly Baroque retellings, rather than evidence that a Baroque original was pruned down into 4 verses and then independently regrew elsewhere. This matters because it puts a helpful boundary around how we talk about the missing parts of the torso. If the later retellings are developments, then they cannot simply be read back as if they were the erased head and limbs of Genesis 6. They may preserve old ideas. They may echo earlier stories that were circulating orally. They may even, at a few points, conserve stray details from traditions that never made it into the Hebrew Bible at all. But the mainstream view does not treat them as a kind of photographic negative of a lost canonical chapter. They are later interpretations, not a cut-and-paste copy of an earlier draft. There are, of course, dissenting voices. A minority of scholars do argue that some of the extended material about heavenly beings, forbidden knowledge, and hybrid offspring may go back to older, even pre-biblical narratives, and that Genesis 6:1-4 is a severely abridged form of that older material. In their reconstructions, texts like 1 Enoch sometimes look less like creative expansions and more like partial survivals of an earlier mythic cycle that the compilers of Genesis chose to abbreviate or domesticate. Even within that minority, though, there is usually a recognition that what we possess in those later writings is not a pristine original but a reworked, theologically shaped version of whatever older lore may lie behind them. So when we call Genesis 6 a torso, we are not licensed to point to any later text and say with confidence, "There is the missing head." The torso language is descriptive, not documentary. It tells us how the passage behaves within its current literary setting. It does not tell us where to find the rest, or even guarantee that the rest was ever written down in a way that could have been transmitted to us. Oral traditions can expand, contract, and recompose themselves over centuries without leaving neat, parallel records that we can align column by column. This also means that we need to resist a slightly different temptation, one that is subtler but just as strong. It is easy to assume that behind every compact biblical notice that feels mythic or strange, there must have been a single, stable master story. On that assumption, Genesis 6:1-4 would be a fragment of one definite narrative about the sons of God and the mighty men of old, and our only task would be to find the right key in some later literature and restore the lost epic. Yet the history of traditional storytelling rarely works in such a tidy way. It is at least as plausible that these verses crystallize motifs that were already circulating in multiple versions. Rather than a neatly amputated limb from a single tale, they may be a deliberate condensation of a more fluid cluster of ideas. What remains uncertain, even after more than a century of close analysis, is how that condensation happened and when. Scholars disagree about whether the core wording Westermann isolates already had a fixed shape in some pre-biblical setting, or whether it reached its compact form only when it was woven into the Genesis flood narrative. They debate whether the Sons of God phrase reflects a direct memory of a divine council ideology, like the one we see more clearly in some neighbouring cultures, or whether it is already a cautious rephrasing within a more monotheistic frame. They wonder how much of the older mythic colouring was intentionally muted, and how much simply faded as the story was retold in new contexts that no longer shared the same assumptions about heavenly beings and heroic ancestors. There is also no settled agreement about the passage's precise function inside the primeval history. Some interpreters see it as a brief etiological note, explaining the origin and disappearance of figures whose fame lingered in folk memory. Others see it more as a moral preface to the flood, a way of signalling a boundary crossing between heaven and earth that contributes to the broader sense of corruption before the deluge, even if the text never spells out a clear chain of causation. Still, others caution against pressing it into any single role, suggesting that, like many traditional fragments, it may carry multiple resonances at once, part legend, part warning, part echo of an older worldview. What we can say, with some modesty, is that Genesis 6:1-4 appears to preserve a tightly packed remnant of older material, that later writers and communities felt its suggestive power and built new stories around it, and that the direction of dependence in most scholarly reconstructions runs from Genesis outward, not from those later stories back in. Beyond that, we move on uncertain ground. The torso tells us that there was more at some point than these 4 verses now disclose. It does not tell us exactly what that more contained, or where, if anywhere, we might find it again. If Genesis 6:1-4 is a torso, Deuteronomy 32 is something like a fossilized song. It appears near the end of the Pentateuch in the narrative setting of Moses' final days. Israel is on the threshold of the land, but not yet across. Moses has been told that he will see the land from a distance and then die. Before that happens, the story has him teach the people a long poetic composition that tradition calls the Song of Moses. The poem is not a gentle lullaby. It traces a sweeping arc from creation to covenant, to apostasy to punishment, and finally to a kind of restoration. It remembers a time when Israel was not yet a people, when the nations were being arranged, when boundaries were being set. It imagines God as both an ancient creator and a betrayed benefactor, one who found Israel in a wilderness, nursed it to strength, and then watched it turn to other gods. The tone moves between praise, accusation, lament, and warning, as if trying to compress an entire theology of history into a single extended utterance. Right near its beginning sits Deuteronomy 32:8, a verse that at first glance can look like just another poetic flourish in a long catalogue of divine actions. In many English Bibles it reads in some form like this: "When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to some measure or standard, and then, in the next verse, Israel is named as the portion belonging to the Lord." It sounds like an echo of the Tower of Babel story, or perhaps a generalized memory of humanity's scattering across the earth. Yet this small verse turns out to be one of the most contested lines in the Hebrew Bible, not because of its basic plot, but because of a single phrase that appears in more than one ancient form. The line about setting boundaries according to does not say the same thing in all of our earliest witnesses. Depending on which ancient manuscript one is reading, it can say that the borders were arranged according to the number of the sons of Israel, or according to the number of the sons of God, or according to a closely related expression that seems to point in one of those directions, but with a slightly different wording. One medieval tradition of the Hebrew text reflects one of these readings. The earliest Greek translation reflects another, a fragment from Qumran, copied by a Jewish scribe before the time of Jesus, gives us yet another piece of the puzzle. On the surface, this may sound like the kind of minor variation that philologists handle every day, and that most readers never notice. Ancient texts are copied by hand, mistakes are made, phrases get smoothed out or harmonized. That is simply how manuscripts behave. But Deuteronomy 32:8 has drawn unusual attention, because the differences here are not just spelling errors or minor slips. They affect who is imagined as present at the division of the nations, and how Israel's place among those nations is framed. The verse seems to stand at a crossroads between a more strictly monotheistic way of speaking and an older pattern of language in which a high God presides over a larger assembly of heavenly beings. When a single line of poetry carries that much theological weight, and when that line can be read in at least 4 distinguishable ways across our sources, textual historians begin to pay very close attention. They ask which reading, if any, is older. They ask which readings might reflect deliberate changes rather than accidental ones. They ask how each wording fits within the immediate context of the Song of Moses, and how each one resonates with other biblical passages that speak about nations, boundaries, and divine assemblies. The question is not only what the verse really said at some hypothetical starting point, but how different communities of readers and copyists understood and reshaped it over time. This is where Deuteronomy 32:8 earns its reputation as a verse with 4 faces. One face belongs to the Masoretic tradition, the carefully transmitted medieval Hebrew text that stands behind most Jewish and many Christian Bibles, where the nation's boundaries are linked to the number of the children of Israel. Another face appears in the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation produced in stages by Jews living in the Hellenistic world, where the dividing of the nations is described in relation to the angels or sons of God. A third face appears in at least one Qumran manuscript from the Dead Sea region, whose Hebrew wording seems to align more closely with the Greek than with the later Masoretic reading. And a fourth face emerges when we consider how later interpreters, both Jewish and Christian, tried to make sense of these variations, sometimes harmonizing them, sometimes choosing one and explaining away the others. For our purposes here, the interest is not in announcing a winner among these faces in advance. It is more in noticing that they coexist, that they testify to a fluidity in the textual tradition, and that this fluidity touches on precisely the themes that have already come into focus when we looked at Genesis 1 and Genesis 6. Creation, population, the ordering of the world, the relationship between a supreme deity and a broader heavenly court, and the special status of Israel within a crowded landscape of nations. Deuteronomy 32:8, in its different forms, seems to hover over that same conceptual territory, but from a later point of view and within a very different literary form. Because this verse sits inside a poem, it also invites a slightly different kind of caution. Poetic language can be dense, elusive, and deliberately multivalent. A scribe who found one wording puzzling might have substituted another that felt more transparent or more doctrinally safe. A translator working into Greek might have made a choice that seemed obvious in that linguistic and cultural setting, even if it obscured a nuance in the Hebrew. A later community encountering both readings might have preferred one on theological grounds, not because they knew more about the original state of the text, but because one version fit better with how they had learned to speak about God and the nations. All of this makes Deuteronomy 32:8 an unusually rich test case for thinking about how biblical texts evolve in transmission. It offers a small, manageable window into processes that usually remain hidden. Through it, we can watch ancient scribes and translators negotiating between inherited phrases and current convictions, between older images of a divine assembly and newer patterns of monotheistic devotion. We can see, in miniature, how a single line can become a site of quiet revision, not in a conspiracy-laden sense of deliberate suppression, but in the more ordinary sense of communities reshaping their sacred language to align with their deepest intuitions about God and the world. In the next step, we will slow down and look more closely at these different witnesses. We will set the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Qumran fragment side by side, not to crown one as the real Deuteronomy 32:8 once and for all, but to observe how each renders the same basic scene and what each implies about the structure of the cosmos and the place of Israel within it. The aim will be modest, simply to let the four faces of this verse come into focus, and to see how they can all belong to the same ancient song. When we bring the witnesses into view, it helps to move slowly, one at a time, and to remember that each of them is a snapshot, not the whole landscape. They are like voices caught mid-sentence. None of them gets to decide alone what Deuteronomy 32:8 really was, but each gives us a different angle on how that line was being heard and transmitted. We can begin with the Masoretic text, not because it is necessarily the oldest form, but because it is the most familiar. This is the carefully vocalized and annotated Hebrew text preserved by Jewish scribes in the early medieval period and stabilized through their work. In this tradition, Deuteronomy 32:8 says, in essence, that when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance and set their boundaries, he did so according to the number of the sons of Israel. The picture here is comparatively straightforward. The nations of the world have their allotted territories. Israel has its own, and there is a kind of symmetry between the count of the peoples out there and the count of the tribes within Israel. Later Jewish interpretation often leaned into this, connecting the verse with the traditional number of Israelite tribes and seeing in it a reassurance that Israel's fate is built into the architecture of the world. Set beside this, the wording preserved in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls sounds different. Among the Deuteronomy manuscripts from Qumran is a small fragment known to scholars as 4Q Deutsche or 4Q 37. It does not give us the whole verse. It does not even give us a complete line. What it preserves is a brief stretch of text that includes very clearly the Hebrew phrase, sons of God. Most specialists agree that this fragment is copying Deuteronomy 32:8, and that this phrase belongs at exactly the point where the Masoretic text has sons of Israel. On that reading, the poem originally said that the Most High fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. This is a more unsettling image, at least to later monotheistic ears. It seems to conjure a heavenly assembly, a group of divine beings over whom the Most High presides, and in relation to whom the earthly nations are ordered. It sounds less like a simple numerical comparison with Israel's tribes, and more like a cosmic map, in which each people has some correspondence to a member of the divine council. At the same time, it is important to stress how little of the verse 4Q37 actually preserves. The manuscript is fragmentary. It gives us only a few words. We do not have the whole line, we do not have the surrounding verses in that same hand, and we do not have independent confirmation that the scribe did not adapt or harmonize in some way. So while sons of God in this fragment is a striking data point, it is still only one small piece in a much larger jigsaw. If we turn to the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, we find that its translators had already made an interpretive decision about how to render this problematic phrase. In the standard Greek tradition of Deuteronomy 32:8, the line about the nations being divided and their boundaries fixed concludes with a reference not to the sons of Israel, and not in so many words to the sons of God, but to the angels of God. The Greek phrase varies slightly across manuscripts, but the majority reading clearly points in this direction. It reshapes an ambiguous or theologically thorny Hebrew construction into something that late Second Temple Jewish readers would likely have found more acceptable, instead of talking about sons of God in a way that might suggest multiple deities. It speaks of God's angelic messengers or servants. This is not simply a change out of thin air. The move from sons of God to angels of God is a reasonably natural one in Greek, and it aligns with a broader Second Temple tendency to reinterpret older divine council language in terms of angels. The translators appear to have assumed a Hebrew vorlage that said something like sons of God, and to have made explicit what they took that to mean in their own time and idiom. The result is that the Greek line still imagines a structured heavenly world overseeing the nations, but it does so in a way that leans away from any hint of multiple gods and toward a hierarchy of subordinate heavenly beings. At this point, a complication arises even within the Greek tradition. Most Septuagint manuscripts say angels of God, but not all. A minority witness known in scholarly notation as manuscript 848 does something more conservative. Instead of angels, it has sons of God. In other words, this Greek manuscript appears to have resisted the smoothing interpretive move that became standard in the Septuagint tradition, and to have tried to stay closer to the underlying Hebrew phrase as it understood it. It does not solve our problem, but it does strengthen the sense that sons of God was the wording lurking behind both the Qumran fragment and the dominant Greek paraphrase. When we set these witnesses next to one another, a pattern begins to emerge even through all the caution and uncertainty. The Masoretic text says, sons of Israel. The majority Septuagint says, angels of God. The minority Greek witness, manuscript 848, says sons of God. The tiny Qumran fragment 4Q37, as far as it goes, also says sons of God. Different as these phrasings are, they seem to converge on one underlying reality. Every non-Masoretic form of the verse appears to presuppose a Hebrew reading along the lines of sons of God, whether it preserves that wording outright, as 4Q37. And 848 do, or translates and interprets it, as the Septuagint does. That does not, by itself, prove that sons of God is older than sons of Israel, or that one is right and the other wrong. It does, however, show that by the time of Qumran and the Greek translators, Jewish readers were working with or remembering a version of the Song of Moses, in which Deuteronomy 32:8 situated the ordering of the nations in relation to a heavenly community of beings around the Most High. Later, in the Masoretic tradition, the same poetic line would come to be heard in a more narrowly national key, with the count of Israel's children as the organizing measure. Between those two ways of speaking lies a whole history of interpretation and revision that textual critics try, with varying degrees of confidence, to reconstruct. When specialists step back from the individual manuscripts and try to describe what is most likely going on, they do reach a fairly stable judgment. Emmanuel Tov, who has spent a lifetime cataloguing and weighing these sorts of differences, speaks of the Masoretic form of Deuteronomy 32:8 as an anti-polytheistic alteration. In his view, and in the view of many of his colleagues, the shift from sons of God to sons of Israel is best understood as a scribal correction that tones down older language about a heavenly council. It keeps the basic structure of the poem, but narrows its horizon. Where the older wording seems to imagine the nations being apportioned in relation to a group of divine beings, the Masoretic wording speaks instead in terms of Israel's tribes. On this point, the consensus among textual critics is that the Masoretic reading is the later revision. That sentence needs to be heard carefully. It does not mean that anyone has a video of the change being made. It does not mean that we can identify the exact scribe, the precise date, or the precise place where sons of God was first replaced by sons of Israel. What it does mean is that, when the known evidence is laid out on the table, the pattern most scholars find persuasive is that sons of God stands closer to the form of the verse used by the poem's earliest transmitters, and that sons of Israel reflects a later stage in which that earlier phrase has been domesticated. In textual criticism, calling something a later revision is a technical judgment, not a time machine. It is a way of arranging the readings in a probable sequence. One starts with whatever looks like the best explanation of all the surviving data. In this case, that data includes a Qumran fragment with sons of God, a minority Greek witness with sons of God, a majority Greek tradition that seems to presuppose sons of God, but paraphrases it as angels, and a much later, carefully stabilized Hebrew tradition that says sons of Israel. When these are set in a line, it is easier to see sons of Israel as a deliberate adjustment to more conservative language than to imagine a path that begins with sons of Israel, moves out to sons of God, and then comes halfway back again through angles of God. The first path requires one change. The second requires several in different directions. At the same time, textual critics are usually the first to warn that such reconstructions are models, not certainties. When they describe a reading as secondary, they are saying that, given current evidence, it most probably grew out of the other reading, and not the other way round. They are not claiming to watch the ink dry on the parchment. The process is more like trying to reconstruct the steps of a recipe from the finished dish and a few scattered notes than like following instructions written out in advance. You look at the ingredients on the counter, the smudged comments in the margin, and the taste of the meal, and you infer the likely sequence. Another cook with slightly different evidence, or a different sense of how the flavours work, might propose an alternative. The distinction matters, especially in a verse as theologically sensitive as Deuteronomy 32:8. It would be easy to overstate the case and say that we can see monotheism being invented here, or to claim that one little fragment from Qumran forces us to rewrite the story of Israel's faith. Textual critics, by and large, do not make such claims. They say something more modest and, in its own way, more interesting. They say that at some point in the transmission of this ancient poem, a scribe or group of scribes chose to replace a phrase that sounded like a council of divine beings with a phrase that pointed more directly to Israel. They say that this fits into a wider pattern in which older, more mythic language about the heavenly realm is gradually reframed in terms that later readers found safer or easier to integrate into strict monotheism. This is where the variant begins to matter for the history of religious language. If sons of God does indeed lie behind the non-Masoretic forms of the verse, then we are looking at a moment when Israelite tradition could speak quite straightforwardly about a divine assembly without feeling the need to soften it. The Most High stands at the head of a council. The nations are apportioned in relation to that council. Israel, in the verses that follow, is singled out as the people belonging directly to the Lord's own portion. It is a world-view in which other heavenly beings exist and have some role in the ordering of the world, even if one deity stands above them all. If, on the other hand, we read only the Masoretic sons of Israel, we hear a different register. The heavenly scene recedes, and the focus settles on the correspondence between the peoples of the earth and the internal structure of Israel itself. The language is still poetic, but it feels more self-contained, more focused on Israel's special place in the divine plan than on the architecture of the unseen realm. The difference between these phrasings is not just a matter of counting. It is a window, however small, into the way the community's God talk was narrowing and sharpening over time. Across the Hebrew Bible, there are other places where older expressions about gods or sons of God seem to have been reread or rephrased in later periods. Deuteronomy 32:8 sits among them as one more piece of that larger mosaic. Its textual history suggests that ancient Israelite religion did not spring fully formed as a pure, abstract monotheism, but moved gradually over generations toward more exclusive language. The change from sons of God to sons of Israel, if that is indeed the direction of travel, would then be one small step in a long process of tightening the boundaries of what could be safely said about the divine. For listeners who are used to thinking of Scripture as a fixed, unchanging text, this can be disorienting. For textual critics, it is simply the kind of quiet, incremental shift that happens when poems and stories are copied, prayed, sung, and interpreted over centuries. The Deuteronomy variant does not give us a hidden chapter that was cut out of Genesis, and it does not reveal a conspiracy in a back room. It shows instead the ordinary work of scribes and communities trying to bring their inherited language about God into alignment with what they had come to believe. There is, however, another kind of evidence that sits alongside all of this reconstruction. It does not come from comparing fragments in different languages, or from weighing which reading best explains the others. It comes from Judaism's own internal memory of places where scribes are said to have adjusted the text. That memory goes under a somewhat technical name, the Tiqqune Sopherim, usually translated as the corrections of the scribes. The basic idea is simple. At a certain point in the tradition, Jewish scholars looked over the text they had received and identified a small set of verses where earlier scribes were believed to have changed the wording out of reverence or out of a desire to avoid saying something that sounded irreverent or theologically awkward. Those supposed changes were not left as rumours. They were written down, catalogued, and passed on as a list. That list is what later readers came to know as the Tiqqune Sopherim. You do not find these corrections printed in the lines of the Hebrew Bible itself. You find them in the margins. The Masoretes, those medieval scholars who stabilized the consonants, preserved the vowel tradition, and recorded all sorts of statistical notes about the text, also preserved this earlier list of scribal emendations. In many printed editions of the Hebrew Bible that follow the Masoretic tradition, you will see little marginal annotations, often quite terse, that refer to the Tiqqune Sopherim. They function as a kind of running commentary on the text's own history, quietly flagging places where tradition said the wording had once stood differently. The list does not only appear in Masoretic margins, it also shows up in early rabbinic literature. The McCarthy, a halachic midrash on Exodus, alludes to the idea that the ancient scribes adjusted certain expressions. Later collections like Midrash Tanhuma mention specific verses where God is said to have allowed the prophets or scribes to write one thing instead of another out of respect for the divine name or character. These are not dry footnotes. In the midrashic setting, the idea of a Tiqqune Sopherim becomes a way of talking about the tension between what might be said in the most literal terms and what ought to be said in a way that befits the holiness of God. Traditionally, 18 such corrections are listed. Different manuscripts and commentators sometimes count them slightly differently, but the standard number that circulates in Jewish scholarship is 18. They range across the Hebrew Bible, touching books like Genesis, Numbers, Samuel, and the Prophets, and they tend to focus on moments where, if taken very literally, the older wording might have sounded as if it spoke disrespectfully of God, or put words or actions into the divine mouth that later readers felt needed careful handling. The list begins with an episode in Genesis that already had a long interpretive history for other reasons, Genesis 18:22. In the story as it now stands in the Masoretic text, Abraham is standing before the Lord as he begins to intercede for Sodom. Traditional Jewish lists of the Tiqqune Sopherim say that an earlier form of the verse had the Lord standing before Abraham, and that the direction was reversed out of reverence. There is, according to this tradition, something improper about depicting God as the one who stands before a human being, so the roles are swapped. The narrative flow barely changes, the theological nuance does. For our purposes, the point is not to insist that we can prove beyond doubt that this one verse once had the exact opposite syntax. The manuscripts we have, including very old ones, mostly reflect the same wording. What matters is that Jewish tradition itself preserved an explicit memory that, at least in principle, such a reversal could be made, and that in this and other cases it had been made. The Tiqqune Sopherim are a self-conscious acknowledgement that the text as presently read is not always identical to what was first written, and that certain adjustments were not only tolerated but considered pious. This makes the Tiqqune Sopherim a very different kind of data from something like the Deuteronomy 32:8 variants. With Deuteronomy, modern scholars piece together a likely sequence of readings by comparing separate textual families. With the Tiqqune Sopherim, the tradition itself is telling you, in effect, here is a place where our ancestors believed the wording had been touched. In one case, you are reconstructing silently from the outside. In the other, you're listening to a community narrate its own textual history, however schematically. Even here, though, the language needs to stay careful. The Tiqqune Sopherim are not, in themselves, a chain of notarized records. They do not give us names, dates, or documentary proof that a particular scribe sat down one afternoon and altered a scroll. They are a list of places where later readers felt a tension between the surface wording and their sense of reverence, and where that tension was strong enough that they told stories about earlier scribes, smoothing it out. The list is a tradition about alteration, and not a laboratory report on alteration itself. That is part of what makes the Tiqqune Sopherim important in a discussion like this one. They show that the idea of reverential adjustment is not an invention of modern critical scholarship imposed from the outside. It is something the tradition itself has contemplated and, in a limited set of cases, affirmed. Ancient and medieval Jewish scholars could hold two convictions at once: that the text of Scripture was sacred and authoritative, and that in certain rare verses the wording had been gently adjusted out of awe for the one it spoke about. It is also worth noticing how small the list is. 18 verses in a corpus as large as the Hebrew Bible is a tiny fraction. Whatever one makes of the individual cases, The Tiqqune Sopherim do not portray a Bible that is constantly being rewritten in sweeping ways. They portray a Bible that on the whole is copied with great care, with an occasional highly self-conscious tweak in places where the literal phrasing seemed to sit uneasily with the community's sense of the divine. So when modern textual critics talk about something like Deuteronomy 32:8 as a likely anti-polytheistic adjustment, they are not proposing a kind of scribal behaviour that would have been unthinkable in antiquity. They are describing a pattern that stands broadly in line with what the Tiqqune Sopherim themselves presuppose, that scribes and scholars sometimes try to bring inherited language into closer harmony with the theology they had come to confess, and that later generations sometimes remembered and recorded those efforts. In the context of Genesis and the questions that cluster around it, the Tiqqune Sopherim stand as a quiet reminder. You do not need to imagine a missing chapter being ripped out in the night to account for shifts in tone or emphasis. You can begin with something much more modest and, in many ways, more interesting, a tradition that knows and says that its own text has, here and there, been gently touched by human hands in the service of reverence. Once you begin to follow that thread, another question presents itself almost immediately. If the Tiqqune Sopherim are a list of remembered corrections, how stable is that list, and how literally should it be read as a record of what actually happened on the page? The traditional way of referring to the 18 corrections of the scribes can give the impression of something fixed and sharply defined, the way one might speak of the 10 Commandments. When you start to look at the evidence, the picture becomes softer at the edges. Different manuscripts, different Masoretic traditions, and different rabbinic compilations do not, in fact, all present the Tiqqune Sopherim in precisely the same way. Some lists count 18, some add 1 or 2, some seem to fold related verses together or separate them out. Occasionally a commentator will mention a verse as a tikkun that does not appear in someone else's enumeration. What you have, when you lay the witnesses side by side, is not a single rigid canon of corrections, but a family of overlapping traditions. When modern scholars try to bring some order to this material, they therefore have to do a bit of sorting. Verses that appear again and again across independent lists can be treated as central. Verses that show up only in a late or isolated source might be treated more cautiously. If you gather the references across the major Masoretic notes, the key rabbinic discussions, and the medieval commentaries that explicitly appeal to the idea of a Tiqqune Sopherim, you end up with something a little larger than the famous 18. Depending on how one counts closely related variants, you are in the neighbourhood of 25 distinct passages that some strand of the tradition has at one point or another, associated with scribal correction. This is where the work of McCarthy becomes important, because she attempted to take that diffuse, sometimes inconsistent body of material and ask a straightforward historical question. How many of these verses actually show signs of having been altered at the level of the consonantal text? And how many are better understood as midrashic reflection about what might have been written, or what ought to have been written, if reverence had not intervened? McCarthy's study, which has become something of a standard reference on the Tiqqune Sopherim, proceeds patiently. She catalogues the traditional lists, tracks where they agree and where they diverge, and then places each candidate verse alongside the full range of textual evidence we have: the Masoretic tradition, the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they are available, the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch in Pentateuchal cases, and early translations. She is not simply repeating the rabbinic stories, she is testing them against the surviving manuscript record. Her conclusion is, in one sense, quite conservative. Out of that larger pool of roughly 24 to 25 candidate verses, she finds that only 3 show what she regards as convincing evidence of genuine scribal emendation in the sense most textual critics would recognize, a change to the consonantal text that is both theologically motivated and still faintly traceable in the comparison of witnesses. In the remaining cases, she judges that what the tradition has preserved is better understood as midrashic. That is, a theological reflection framed as the scribes changed it, without there necessarily having been an actual, documentable alteration of letters on a scroll. This does not mean that the other passages are uninteresting, or that the traditions about them are somehow dishonest. On the contrary, they reveal a great deal about how later readers wrestled with difficult or startling verses. Saying the earlier scribes wrote X but wrote Y out of reverence can function as a way of articulating the tension between a raw, literal wording and a more carefully framed one, even if no one ever sat down with a knife and scraped off the original letters. In that sense, most of the Tiqqune Sopherim in McCarthy's reading belong more to the history of interpretation than to the physical history of the text. At the same time, the three cases she does accept as genuine emendations matter, precisely because they confirm that the underlying idea is not purely homiletical. In at least a few places, real scribes working with real scrolls appear to have adjusted wording out of theological concern, and the memory of that adjustment lasted long enough to be woven into the tradition. McCarthy's verdict trims away some of the more expansive claims that might be made on the basis of the Tiqqune Sopherim, but it does not dissolve them into pure legend. For our purposes, this tempered conclusion has two main implications. The first is that it puts a kind of ceiling on how much weight the Tiqqune Sopherim can bear in arguments about hidden alterations. If someone wants to imagine whole episodes excised or major theological themes systematically scrubbed out of the text, the traditional list of scribal corrections is not going to offer strong support. Even in its expanded, harmonized form, we are still talking about roughly 25 verses, and on McCarthy's careful reading, only 3 of those can be said with any real confidence to reflect concrete emendations. That is a vanishingly small proportion of the Hebrew Bible. The second implication, though, pulls in the opposite direction. It would be misleading to treat McCarthy's restraint as if it somehow reinstated an idea of a perfectly untouched, mechanically transmitted text. Her analysis still recognizes that there are places where theological concern seems to have nudged the wording, and that later Jewish scholarship preserved that awareness. It also acknowledges that the line between what the scribes wrote and how later readers imagined the scribes might have written is not always sharp. The very fact that Midrash can so easily speak in the language of correction tells you something about what kinds of interventions the community could envisage. So we are left with a picture that is neither dramatic nor trivial. The Tiqqune Sopherim do not point to a vast program of suppression, or to some lost chapter of Genesis, quietly erased from the record. They point instead to a tradition that knew, at least in principle, that copyists and scholars might sometimes adjust a phrase out of reverence, and that was capable of talking about those adjustments in both historical and imaginative ways. McCarthy's verdict invites us to see that tradition in proportion. Textual alteration is real, but limited. The stories about alteration are plentiful, but not always literal. Between those two facts lies the space in which modern textual criticism and any responsible reading of Genesis has to do its work. Genesis 1, by contrast, gives us no such explicit language of correction, and yet there is a place in that chapter where readers have, for a very long time, felt the urge to ask whether something stands behind the words we now have. It comes almost at the end of the creation sequence, when the calm cadence of "and God said, and it was so" suddenly shifts in a small but jarring way. Instead of the familiar singular divine speech, the text records, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." Within the compact world of Genesis 1, there has been only one speaker up to this point, and only one actor. The heavens and the earth are created by a single God who speaks, and it happens. No helpers are named, no rival powers are described, and no background court has been introduced. The plural form therefore lands with a kind of quiet thud. Who is the us? The text does not say. It never circles back to clarify the phrase, never pauses to explain that God is addressing angels, or heavenly beings, or personified attributes of wisdom, or anything of that sort. In the verses that follow, the grammar moves smoothly back into the singular. So God created humankind in his image, not in their image. The narrative seems to take no notice of the brief plural aside, as if it were of no consequence. Later readers, of course, have not been able to ignore it so easily. A great deal of ingenuity has been poured into answering a question the chapter itself leaves open. One way to approach that question is simply to list the main families of explanation that have emerged, and to notice how each of them appeals to something slightly different in the wider biblical and linguistic context. The first major proposal, and the one many modern critical scholars find most natural, is that the us of Genesis 1:26 reflects what is sometimes called a divine council scene. In this reading, the God of Israel is speaking in the presence of a heavenly assembly, a court of subordinate divine or angelic beings. The plural is then not a puzzle but a kind of stage direction. We happen to catch mid-speech, the king addressing his court before issuing the actual creative command. This idea does not come from Genesis 1 itself, which is otherwise conspicuously spare in its depiction of other heavenly beings, but from elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, especially passages like Psalm 82 or 1 Kings 22, where God is portrayed as presiding over a council. On this view, Genesis 1:26 is not importing polytheism into its carefully monotheizing creation story. The us does not mean that the surrounding members of the council also create humans or share equally in the divine image. It signals, at most, that they are present, being addressed, perhaps being invited to assent to what is about to happen. The singular verbs that follow and the singular his image are sometimes taken as evidence that, even if a council is imagined, only one figure in that council actually carries out the creative act. The divine assembly is the audience, not the agent. A second explanation moves in quite a different direction and focuses less on heavenly courts than on patterns of royal speech. This is the so-called plural of majesty, the idea that kings and other exalted figures sometimes refer to themselves in the plural as a way of expressing dignity, authority, or the corporate nature of their office. Modern English readers may think of monarchs saying, "We are not amused," where "we" does not literally mean multiple persons, but a single sovereign speaking on behalf of the crown, the institution and perhaps the nation they embody. Applied to Genesis 1:26. This reading suggests that there is no us standing behind the phrase at all. The plural is simply an idiom, a way of marking the speaker as majestic. God speaks in a royal plural, and the hearer is not meant to envision a plurality of heavenly beings in the room. Some interpreters who favour this view will note that ancient Near Eastern inscriptions do, from time to time, show rulers using plurals in self-reference, and that the wider cultural milieu of Genesis would not have been unfamiliar with royal exalted language. At the same time, the exact parallels in biblical Hebrew are not abundant, which leads other scholars to be cautious about how much explanatory weight this one idiom can bear. Closely related, but not quite identical, is a third proposal often called the plural of deliberation. In this understanding, the plural does not express majesty so much as inner dialogue. It is something like the ancient equivalent of a person saying, "Let's see," or "What shall we do?" where the speaker is talking to themselves, thinking out loud in a way that grammatically happens to use a plural form. The idea is that the narrative has reached a climactic moment, the creation of humanity, and that the grammar shifts to reflect a heightened level of reflection or decision on God's part. The us here is the solitary divine speaker weighing a choice, not a group being given instructions. Those three explanations, the divine council, the plural of majesty, and the plural of deliberation, cover most of the ground in modern discussion. Each has its strengths and its uncertainties. The Divine Council reading can point to other biblical texts that do, quite explicitly imagine God surrounded by an assembly. The plural of majesty can appeal to known patterns of royal speech and to the strongly monotheistic tone of Genesis 1 as a whole. The plural of deliberation can point to the narrative sense that something unique is happening at this point in the story, a kind of pause for deliberation before the last and most distinctive creative act. None of them, however, can claim to be decisively proven on the basis of Genesis 1 alone, and responsible scholarship often keeps them all in view as possibilities. The text's own refusal to specify an audience leaves a genuine gap, and much of what is said to fill that gap is, to one degree or another, conjectural. The Divine Council model fits some later biblical imagery, but imports into Genesis 1 a heavenly scene the chapter never quite paints. The majestic and deliberative plurals rest on broader claims about idiom and style that not everyone finds compelling in every case. Alongside these three, there is also the long Christian tradition of reading Genesis 1:26 as a veiled reference to the Trinity, and it would be historically misleading to pass over that without mention. For many Christian theologians and preachers, especially in late antique and medieval contexts, the us became a natural place to hear the Father addressing the Son and the Spirit. In that framework, the plural is not about angels or idiom at all. It is about plurality within the one God. Modern critical scholarship, however, tends to treat that specifically Trinitarian reading as anachronistic. The argument is not that it is illegitimate for later Christian readers to hear echoes of their own doctrinal commitments in earlier texts, but that, as a matter of historical reconstruction, it is very unlikely that the original author or first audience of Genesis 1 had anything like Nicene Trinitarian theology in mind. The careful monotheism of the chapter, the lack of any developed intra-divine distinctions, and the broader context of ancient Israelite religion all weigh against treating Genesis 1:26 as an intentional reference to Father, Son, and Spirit in the later sense of those terms. So one ends up with a kind of layered picture. On the surface, there is simply the phrase as it stands, "Let us make humankind in our image," dropped into a narrative that otherwise knows only a single divine agent. Just beneath that surface, interpreters can plausibly imagine a divine council or a royal plural, or a divine deliberation, each making sense of the grammar in a different way, and each leaving room for debate. Further out on the horizon lies the Trinitarian reading, important within the history of Christian interpretation, but, in the judgment of most critical scholars, not a reliable guide to what an ancient Israelite writer thought they were saying. What remains constant across these proposals is the small, stubborn fact that Genesis itself never pauses to clear up the mystery. Unlike the Tiqqune Sopherim, where later tradition openly reflects on changed or problematic wording, here there is no marginal note, no remembered correction, no canonical gloss. There is only a plural verb, a plural pronoun, and a readerly sense that, at this point in the story, someone besides us seems to be in the room, even if the text declines to introduce them by name. Psalm 82 is one of the places where that sense of an unnamed someone else in the room is not just implied by a pronoun but is brought out onto the stage. It begins with a scene that in Hebrew is dense with overlapping terms. God takes his stand in the assembly of El. In the midst of the Elohim he renders judgment. The same word that elsewhere can mean the singular God of Israel is here used twice. Once apparently as a proper name for the presiding figure, and once in the plural for those over whom he stands as judge. The picture is of a courtroom or council chamber. There is a chair at the centre, occupied by the high God, and there are others present who are called, in that same elastic vocabulary, gods. The psalm does not leave them silent. The presiding God addresses the others with sharp questions. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Rescue the needy. The complaint is not about ritual infractions or failures of sacrifice. It is about bad governance, about the abuse of power at the expense of the vulnerable. Then comes the verdict. I said, "You are gods, all of you sons of the Most High. Nevertheless you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. Whatever their status had been, it is now revoked. The council is stripped of its immortality. The closing plea of the psalm, addressed back to the presiding God, is that he should arise, judge the earth, and inherit all nations. For many readers formed by later Jewish and Christian monotheism, this language can feel jarring. It seems to place God in a room with other gods, to grant them a kind of derivative authority, and then to threaten them with death. The strangeness becomes more intelligible when one sets it alongside material from Israel's wider cultural neighbourhood, especially the text from Ugaritic, a late Bronze Age city on the Syrian coast, whose archives were uncovered in the 20th century. In those texts, written in a northwest Semitic language closely related to Hebrew, there appears an assembly or council of the gods presided over by a high god named El. The council meets, deliberates, and disputes. Other deities like Baal present requests and seek El's approval. The whole scene is, in literary terms, a divine bureaucracy, and its vocabulary overlaps in suggestive ways with that of Psalm 82. This parallel has drawn the attention of scholars of ancient Israelite religion because it provides a plausible cultural backdrop for the kind of imagery Psalm 82 uses. The idea that the high God sits in a council of lesser powers, that these powers have jurisdiction over nations or domains, and that their behaviour can be evaluated and punished is not unique to the Bible. It belongs to a broader ancient Near Eastern pattern. The similarity between assembly of El in Psalm 82 and the divine council of El in the Ugaritic Baal cycle is therefore often treated as an echo, not necessarily a direct borrowing of a specific story, but a family resemblance in religious imagination. The Israelite poet seems to be participating in, and at the same time reshaping, a shared stock of images about how heaven is organized. Exactly how to describe that reshaping, however, is not a settled matter. One major line of interpretation takes the Elohim of Psalm 82 at face value as divine beings, members of a heavenly court who exercise delegated authority over parts of the created order. On this reading, the psalm presupposes a kind of tiered spiritual world. There is one God at the top, the Most High, and beneath him a plurality of subordinate powers who can be called gods without implying equality with him. Their crime is that they have governed unjustly. Their punishment is to lose the immortality that came with their office. The psalm then becomes a polemic against unjust heavenly rulers, a declaration that even these exalted beings are answerable to the one supreme judge. Another line of interpretation, especially prominent in some strands of Jewish and Christian exegesis, and in parts of modern scholarship, reads the Elohim here as human judges or rulers rather than as genuinely divine beings. The argument runs in several steps. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, terms like Elohim can, in a few contexts, be applied to human authorities who stand in for God in judicial settings. The charges of injustice in Psalm 82 line up closely with prophetic critiques of corrupt kings and magistrates. The threat, "You shall die like mortals," might then be heard as a way of reminding powerful but finite humans of their limits, rather than as a sentence imposed on immortal spirits. In this view, the psalm is a social critique framed in lofty language, God presiding over a metaphorical assembly of earthly judges, and announcing that their failure to defend the poor will end in their downfall. Between these two readings lies a spectrum of more cautious proposals. Some scholars suggest that the psalm may preserve older motifs of a genuinely divine council, while already moving toward a more exclusive monotheism in which those other beings are demoted, reinterpreted, or even half-remembered. Others argue that the distinction between divine and human in our modern sense may not map neatly onto the conceptual world of the text, where kings, angels, ancestors, and gods could all, at different times, inhabit overlapping categories of honor and authority. In that more fluid picture, pressing Psalm 82 to give a clear either-or answer between heavenly beings and human judges may be asking it to resolve a question it is not designed to address. What most careful commentators agree on is more modest. The psalm very likely draws on an image of a heavenly court that would have been intelligible in its ancient setting, and that image looks at least broadly compatible with what we see in Ugaritic descriptions of El and his council. At the same time, the text is being used to make a pointed claim about justice and about the ultimate supremacy of Israel's God over any other claimants to authority, whether those claimants are imagined as spiritual beings, earthly rulers, or some blend of the two. The Elohim are real enough to be held to account. They are not ultimate enough to escape judgment. Placed alongside Genesis 1:26, with its unexplained let us make, Psalm 82 therefore offers both illumination and complication. It shows that the Hebrew Bible is capable of imagining God in the midst of other Elohim, addressing them, charging them, and overruling them. It gives concrete form to a plural divine scene that Genesis only hints at, if indeed it hints at it at all. Yet even here, where the counsel is explicit and the language is vivid, the fundamental questions do not entirely go away. Are we to hear a memory of an older, more populated divine world now subordinated to a stricter monotheism? Are we listening to a poetic dramatization of God's dealings with very human authorities? Are we seeing both at once? This is one of the places where the material will not quite settle into a single, stable shape. The parallels with Ugaritic texts are strong enough to suggest a shared imaginative background, but not precise enough to prove direct dependence. The language of Elohim is flexible enough to support readings that emphasize heavenly beings or human judges, but not unambiguous enough to rule one of them out. The connection to Genesis's stray plurals is close enough to be tempting, but the texts themselves never draw the line for us. What remains after the philology and the comparisons and the reconstructions is a cluster of images in which God is not always grammatically alone, and a set of unanswered questions about how those images grew, changed, and were finally gathered into the canon as we have it. If Psalm 82 is one of the places where the Bible lets us overhear a crowded heavenly room, Genesis 4 is one of the places where the earth itself suddenly feels more populated than the story has prepared us for. The narrative has been tightly focused. We meet Adam and Eve. We are told of Cain and Abel. We are shown the murder in the field, the confrontation, the curse. The world up to this point in the telling is a small family drama. Yet in the middle of God's sentence on Cain, another world quietly comes into view. Cain's response to his punishment in Genesis 4:14 is not courage or repentance. It is fear. Today you have driven me away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. The last phrase is the one that has lodged in many readers' minds. Whoever finds me. It is an open-ended plural in human form. Cain does not say, when my father finds me, or when my brothers find me, though on one reading those would be the only candidates available. He speaks as if the earth is inhabited by an indefinite whoever, by people who have not appeared in the script. The narrative characteristically does not pause to explain why he would say this or how many others there might be. It simply has God answer that fear with a protective sign and a promise of sevenfold vengeance against anyone who kills him. The fear is taken seriously. The possibility of an avenger whoever is treated as real enough that it needs to be addressed. Once again, as with the plural let us make, we are left with the sense that the story's grammar reaches beyond the cast of characters we have been introduced to. This impression is strengthened a few lines later. Cain goes away from the presence of the Lord and settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Then the text says, without preparation, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. The wife appears fully formed as a narrative fact. She is not named. She is not introduced. We have not been told of any daughters of Eve or of any other human families elsewhere. The story has moved from 4 named humans to the existence of a wife in Nod by means of a single understated clause. For many readers, both ancient and modern, this has been the moment where a quiet but persistent question arises. Where did she come from? If Adam is the first man, Eve the first woman, and Cain and Abel the first children, and if the story has not yet mentioned any others, who exactly populates Cain's dangerous whoever, and who is this woman he marries in his exile? The text as we have it does not linger on the problem. It does not gesture toward a second line of humanity, nor does it itemize Adam and Eve's full household before Cain departs. It simply assumes that a wife is available and that Cain's fear of others is intelligible. Over the centuries, this gap has drawn a wide range of responses. Some readers have treated it as evidence that Genesis presupposes other unnamed human populations, perhaps created in a way the text does not narrate. Others have seen it as a sign that we are dealing here with a compressed tradition, one that has deliberately focused on a single family for theological reasons while leaving the broader human setting in the background. Still others have suggested that the story's horizon is wider than our modern literalist instincts might allow, that whoever finds me is a conventional way of speaking about vengeance and blood feud rather than a census of the planet. Within mainstream Jewish and Christian interpretation, however, a more straightforward answer has long been given, and it is anchored in the very next chapter of the book. Genesis 5 opens with the genealogy of Adam's line. In verse 4, almost as an aside, it states that Adam had other sons and daughters. The text does not specify how many, nor does it name them. It simply asserts that beyond Cain, Abel, and later Seth, there were further children. On this traditional reading, Cain's wife is understood to be one of these daughters. His fear of being killed by whoever finds me is understood to refer to the wider circle of his own extended family, including future generations who might seek to avenge Abel's blood. Read in this way, the puzzle is softened but not entirely erased. Genesis 5:4 arrives after the Cain story in the order of the book. The genealogy looks back over Adam's 930 years and summarizes his fertility in a single sentence. As a chronological claim, it allows in principle for the existence of many sons and daughters by the time of Cain's exile. As a narrative, however, the information comes late. The reader of Genesis encounters Cain's fear, and Cain's wife in chapter 4 before being told, in chapter 5, that Adam had other children at all. The text supplies the raw material for a resolution, but it does so in a different register and at a different point in the story. Keeping the focus on that narrative order helps clarify what is and is not at stake. The question here is not whether one can harmonize the chapters by appealing to Adam's unnamed sons and daughters. Generations of interpreters have done so, and Genesis 5:4 provides a perfectly coherent internal resource for that move. The question is rather how the story presents itself to a first-time listener who is simply following the sequence. That listener meets a world that seems to contain a single nuclear family, and then suddenly hears a condemned murderer speak as if the earth is already populated with potential avengers, and watches him marry a woman whose existence the story has not prepared for. It is this disjunction between the order of telling and the order of later explanation that has made the Cain material a favourite stopping place for both traditional commentators and more speculative thinkers. Some have been content to say that the Bible is not interested in supplying a complete demographic report. and that the mention of other sons and daughters is enough. Others have wondered whether the narrative is quietly acknowledging a larger human world that it does not pause to describe. Still others have treated it as an example of how Genesis often works, offering tightly framed scenes that assume more background than they spell out, and leaving readers to notice the edges where those assumptions show through. Whatever solution one prefers, the important thing for our purposes is to recognize both sides of the picture. The text does, in Genesis 4, create the impression of other people already out there beyond the garden family, sufficiently numerous and real that Cain can fear them and marry among them. And the same text in Genesis 5 gives an internal, traditional answer in the form of Adam's unnamed sons and daughters. The puzzle, then, is not an airtight proof of some lost chapter of alternative humanity. It is an instance of Genesis's habit of hinting at a wider world than it chooses to narrate in detail, of compressing the human story into a few figures while letting phrases like, "whoever finds me," and his wife open small windows onto a population that the book never fully counts. Genesis moves on from Cain's fear and Cain's wife with the same understated confidence. We are told that she bears a son, and that Cain names him Enoch. Then, in Genesis 4:17, the narrative adds one more brief line that has carried a surprising amount of weight in later reflection. Cain, it says, knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. The verse is sparse, almost formulaic. A birth, a building, a naming, yet each element quietly shifts the scale of what we are imagining. To speak of a city at all, in a story that has so far kept its focus on gardens and fields and family altars, is a striking move. The world of Genesis 2 and 3 is rural and primordial. Even the murder scene in Genesis 4 is set in the field. Then suddenly we are told that Cain, the fugitive and wanderer, settles in a distant land, becomes a husband and father, and undertakes the founding of something called a city. The text does not pause to describe it. We hear nothing of walls or streets or markets or rulers. There is only the bare assertion that a city existed and that it bore his son's name. For many readers, the introduction of a city raises the same kind of background questions that Cain's "whoever finds me" had already stirred up. A city, as we normally use the term, implies a certain density of population, a level of social organization, and a degree of permanence. It suggests multiple households, some division of labor, some shared infrastructure. It feels instinctively like more than a nuclear family and a handful of descendants scattered across a valley. If Cain can build a city, one might think, then there must be enough people around to justify its construction, enough community to fill its dwellings and walk its lanes. That inference lies behind a long history of interpretation in which Cain's city has been treated as evidence of a wider human world, whether descended from Adam and Eve in unrecorded lines, or existing in parallel as some sort of other humanity. On this way of reading, a city is simply too big a thing to be founded by one man and his immediate family. So the verse is taken as a hint that Genesis is compressing a much fuller demographic reality. There may be something to that intuition. Our modern sense of what counts as a city and the archaeological picture of early urbanization in Mesopotamia and beyond do suggest that by the time people are building anything we would call a city, population levels are no longer in the dozens. Yet the Hebrew word behind our English translations asks us to slow down a little before we rush to that conclusion. The term used in Genesis 4:17 is In later biblical books, certainly can refer to large complex settlements with gates, elders, marketplaces, and fortifications. Jerusalem is an Nineveh is an but the same word is also used for much smaller, more rudimentary sites. In some contexts, Ir seems to denote any walled or defended place, any enclosed settlement that can be contrasted with open country or unwalled villages. It may be a hilltop stronghold, a fortified encampment, or a modest cluster of houses ringed with a protective barrier. This broader semantic range has led many scholars and traditional commentators to suggest that Cain's city need not be imagined as a sprawling metropolis. It could just as well have been a fortified enclosure, a defensible settlement built by a small kin group in a world that still felt dangerous and uncertain. On this reading, the focus is less on urban scale and more on a psychological and social shift. The murderer who feared being killed, whoever finds me, now surrounds himself and his descendants with walls. He creates a place of refuge, a permanent base that marks his presence in the land of Nod. The naming of the enclosure after his son then becomes a way of claiming continuity and legacy in the face of exile. Presenting the fortified enclosure option is not a way of evading the text. It is an attempt to take seriously how the word Ir functions across the Hebrew Bible. There are passages where it clearly refers to small strongholds that we would hesitate to label cities in modern usage. There are others where it marks the presence of minimal defensive works rather than full urban infrastructure. Within that spectrum, Cain's could occupy a more modest place. It might have been large enough to house an extended family and associated dependents, with simple walls or earthworks to mark it off from the surrounding land, without requiring a population in the thousands. At the same time, this linguistic flexibility does not make all the questions vanish. Even a fortified enclosure presupposes more than one household. Building any sort of meaningful defensive perimeter, organizing labour to construct and maintain it, and sustaining a settlement that is fixed enough to be named after a child rather than a passing campsite, all suggest a social world that is beginning to thicken. Whether we imagine a small stockaded hamlet or an early town, we are no longer dealing with a solitary wanderer and his wife. There are now multiple generations, perhaps multiple related families, cooperating in a sustained project. The fortified enclosure reading therefore softens the jump from lonely exile to bustling city, but it does not completely erase the sense that Genesis is gesturing toward a broader human scene. The text is comfortable speaking of a city even when it does not describe its inhabitants. It is content to let Cain's architectural project stand as a marker of something new in human organization, without counting the heads that will live within its boundaries. What it gives us is not a census, but a symbolically charged act. The murderer founds a named place, perhaps the first fixed settlement in the narrative, and ties it to his line through his son's name. There is also quite possibly an echo here of wider ancient Near Eastern patterns. Stories about primordial kings and their founding of the first cities are a familiar motif in Mesopotamian literature. Later, Israelite audiences would have known of city-founding heroes and of urban centres that claimed ancient, even mythical origins. Genesis 4's brief notice that Cain built a city named for his son may be participating in that familiar way of talking about origins, setting its own line of descent alongside other cultural memories of how towns and strongholds began. The text does not elaborate the parallel, and it would be speculative to press it too far, but the resonance is there for those who listen for it. In the end, the city named Enoch remains one of those compact phrases in Genesis that open more doors than they close. The Hebrew allows us to imagine something smaller and more rudimentary than a modern city, and that possibility deserves to be taken seriously. At the same time, any city, in the sense that Ir carries, points to a level of social coordination and settled life that goes beyond a single nuclear family on the move. The verse does not settle the population question raised by Cain's fear or Cain's wife. It simply carries the story one step further, from wandering to settlement, from nameless fields to a named place, and leaves the size and makeup of that place in the quiet space between its words. When modern scholars turn to Genesis 4 and its quiet sequence of murders, wanderings, wives and cities, they often bring one more tool to the table. Alongside questions about language and archaeology, they ask about how the chapter itself is put together. On this view, Genesis 4 is not a single seamless story composed in one sitting, but a composite text, woven from older narrative pieces and adapted sayings, arranged in a way that serves certain purposes for later Israelite readers. The seams are not always obvious, especially in translation, but some features begin to stand out once you look for them. One of those features is what biblical studies calls etiological storytelling. The term can sound technical, but the idea is simple. An etiological tale is a story told to explain why something bears the name it does, or why a custom is followed, or how a particular institution began. It moves from an existing feature of the world, already familiar to the audience, back to a narrative origin placed in the distant past. The direction of explanation runs from the present to the past, rather than from the past to the present. The city exists. The story steps in to say who founded it and why it has its name. Genesis is full of moments that have at least an etiological flavour. Babel is linked to the confusion of tongues. Beersheba is tied to a well and an oath. Israel itself becomes the name given after a wrestling encounter. Even when scholars disagree about how far to press the category, there is a wide recognition that many short narrative units in the Pentateuch function to give meaningful backstories to names and practices that would otherwise be opaque. Listeners who already know the place or the custom hear in these tales a kind of narrative footnote explaining how it came to be. Within that framework, Genesis 4 can be read as a cluster of etiological units, loosely strung along a genealogical line. Cain's name is linked to a wordplay on getting or acquiring. His occupation and Abel's may echo a remembered tension between farmers and shepherds. The curse of restless wandering offers a background for certain marginal groups. The city named Enoch gives a venerable origin to a particular settlement, or to the very idea of fortified places. The short notices about the descendants of Cain, with their association with tents, music, and metallurgy, look very much like etiologies for crafts and ways of life that were already present in Israel's world. If this is right, then Genesis 4 is doing something more literary and more layered than simply telling what happened next after Eden. It is gathering older narrative fragments, some of which may have circulated independently, and arranging them under the umbrella of Adam's line. Each fragment may have been told at some earlier stage to explain a specific feature of the known world, a city out there, a clan over here, a tool or art that marked a group's identity. When these fragments are drawn into the primeval history, they carry with them a tacit assumption that the world is already occupied, already differentiated into settlements, trades and lineages. That is where the sense of a populated earth often creeps in. A story that originally explained the name of an established city will, by definition, presuppose that there are people enough to inhabit it. A narrative that gives a primeval ancestor to a class of metalworkers or pastoral nomads assumes that such groups exist in the storyteller's present. When those same etiological pieces are relocated into the early chapters of Genesis, they quietly import their social background, their crowded horizon of unnamed others. The text itself does not list these others, but the etiological logic implies their presence. Composite texts, in this way of thinking, can preserve older levels of tradition without always harmonizing them. A scribe or redactor who wanted to place Cain's city within the story of Eden's aftermath might have been less concerned with demographic consistency than with linking an already known place to the deep past. The question of how many people were alive at this point in universal history was probably not the driving concern. The aim was to fold local memories and explanations into a grand narrative of beginnings. The result is a storyline in which primeval figures move across a landscape that feels at moments more socially developed than the immediate narrative would lead you to expect. This has led some interpreters to suggest, carefully, that Genesis 4 contains traces of older stories that once lived in a framework where Adam and Eve were not the only humans on Earth, or at least not the only ancestors being talked about. The Cain materials might have been, in their pre-Genesis form, origin stories for particular clans, towns, or professions within a wider human context. The later editor, working within a monotheistic and monogenetic theology, has drawn them under one ancestral pair, but small narrative tensions remain: the fear of unknown killers, the unnamed wife, the city without a census. Yet, when all of this is said, the critical reading still has to stop short of some of the more imaginative conclusions that have been drawn from it. To say that Genesis 4 is composite, and that some of its units function etiologically, is not the same as proving that the Bible secretly teaches a second, non-Adamic humanity. What the scholarship, at its most careful, actually highlights is a matter of narrative order and literary layering. The chapter, as we have it, folds a range of origin tales into a chronological flow that begins with a single couple. Those tales may carry traces of a world already full of people and places, but that is an inference about the history of traditions, not a clear doctrinal statement about multiple creations. The honest conclusion, if we stay with what the text and the methods can reasonably bear, is modest. Genesis 4 contains signs of literary growth and of etiological interest. Those signs explain why the narrative sometimes seems to presuppose more people and institutions than it explicitly introduces. They invite us to imagine an editorial process in which older, more local stories were inserted into a universal history of humanity. They do not by themselves demonstrate that there was a real, literal chapter cut from Genesis describing a pre-Adamic population that once filled the earth alongside or before Adam and Eve. In other words, the puzzle turns out to be about how the story is told, not a hidden census of a lost humanity. The gaps and overlaps in Genesis 4 reflect the way ancient authors and editors stitched together their materials and gave theological shape to inherited traditions. They open up questions about composition, redaction, and the aims of etiological storytelling. They do not resolve, one way or another, the speculative systems that later readers will build on top of them. Those later systems, however, are part of the history of interpretation, and they have shaped real debates, controversies, and even persecutions. Centuries after Genesis 4 was copied and recopied, a French thinker named Isaac Le Peyrère would look at some of the same narrative tensions: the fear of unknown others, the city, the unexplained peoples beyond Eden, and propose a bold theory of humans before Adam. His story, unlike the early chapters of Genesis, is historically traceable. We can follow his publications, the reactions of church and state, the trial, the pressure, and the eventual recantation. To understand how far readers have been willing to go with the hints of Genesis 4, we now turn from the ancient composite text to the very modern life of one man who tried to make pre-Adamites a matter of doctrine. Isaac Le Peyrère was born around 1596 in Bordeaux into a milieu that was already complicated. He was of Jewish descent, raised in a Catholic environment, connected to Huguenot circles, and eventually found work as a secretary and counsellor to a powerful noble family. He moved in educated, courtly spaces where theology, politics, and emerging scholarship all rubbed against each other. By the middle of the 17th century, he had become one of those restless, erudite figures who read scripture with the tools of philology and history, and who were willing, at least in private, to push questions further than the catechisms allowed. In 1655 in Amsterdam, a book appeared in Latin with no author's name on the title page. Its title was Prae-Adamitae, which simply means pre-Adamites. It was printed in the Dutch Republic, where censorship was comparatively light and theological experiments could be floated under cover of anonymity. Behind the scenes, however, the project was not marginal. The printing was financed by no less a figure than Queen Christina of Sweden, who had recently abdicated her throne, converted to Catholicism, and settled into a life as an eccentric, intellectually curious patron in Europe's Republic of Letters. She was fascinated by unorthodox ideas and by the possibility that old texts might yield new, startling readings. Prae-Adamitae set out to argue something that many churchmen already regarded as unthinkable, that there had been human beings on earth before Adam, and that these people were not simply ignored by Scripture, but could be detected within it if one read carefully. Peyrère's central thesis was that Adam was not the first human ever created, but the first ancestor of a particular chosen line, the one that culminated in Israel. The rest of humanity on this view descended from earlier men and women whom God had made before the story narrated in Genesis 2 and 3. To reach this conclusion, Peyrère assembled a cluster of biblical and textual observations. He lingered on Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as if they were two distinct creation accounts, not just two angles on the same event. He proposed that Genesis 1, with its creation of man in the image of God, male and female, referred to a first, general humanity, spread across the earth. Genesis 2, with its fashioned Adam, its garden and its genealogical focus, he took to be a later, more specific act, in which God selected and formed a particular progenitor for the people who would receive the law. He returned to the same narrative tensions that had caught the eye of later readers. Cain's fear of being killed by others after he is driven out. The building of a city at a time when, on a straightforward reading, there is only a single nuclear family. The mention of nations and kings in later parts of Genesis that seem to presuppose long-standing peoples and political structures. Peyrère treated these not as loose threads to be explained away, but as clues. If there are already others for Cain to fear, he reasoned, and if there is already a population dense enough to make a city meaningful, then Scripture itself implies the existence of human communities outside Adam's direct line. He also brought Paul into the picture. In Romans 5, Paul speaks of sin and death entering through one man and spreading to all. Peyrère suggested that Paul was speaking in covenantal terms about the relation between Adam and the people bound up with the Mosaic law, rather than about biological descent for every human being who had ever lived. In this reading, Adam is the federal head of a particular people, not the biological origin of the entire species. Other texts about the nations and about God's dealings with peoples beyond Israel were folded into this framework, giving Peyrère a kind of biblical map in which Adam's story sits within a wider, older human world. For readers formed in a strict monogenetic tradition, the implications were unsettling. If there were men before Adam, what did that mean for original sin, for the unity of the human race, for the doctrine that Christ, as the second Adam, redeemed all who share Adam's nature and guilt? Peyrère's argument seemed to carve humanity into two histories, one traced from an earlier silent creation, and another traced from the garden and the fall. Even though he tried to keep his system within a broadly Christian frame, the effect was to loosen long-standing doctrinal connections between Genesis, Paul, and universal redemption. The timing mattered as well. Europe in the mid-17th century was wrestling with reports from the Americas, Africa, and Asia, with newly detailed knowledge of peoples the Bible did not mention by name. Some thinkers were already asking how all these nations could have descended from one couple in the available time. Others were probing the text of Scripture with new philological methods, comparing manuscripts, attending to variant readings, and noting small incongruities. In that atmosphere, a book that used biblical criticism to propose an entire race of humans before Adam looked to some like an alarming escalation. Prae-Adamitae thus occupies a peculiar place in the history of this topic. It is not a lost chapter of Genesis, and it does not uncover a secret subtext that modern scholarship has verified, but it is one of the few attempts to turn the hints and gaps of Genesis into a formal printed doctrine of pre-Adamic humanity. It was a book that had to be smuggled into print, supported by a queen who delighted in theological risk and circulated under a veil of anonymity. In a landscape where most of what we have been discussing are subtle textual shifts and quiet editorial seams, this was the one moment when the idea of men before Adam took the form of an actual forbidden book, with all the consequences that would follow once the author's name became known. The consequences came quickly. A work that had slipped into the world under the relative shelter of Dutch presses and an anonymous title page now began to attract the kind of attention that left marks in official records. The title, Prae-Adamitae, which at first had just been a quiet provocation in Latin, became something you could indict and condemn in formal decrees. In early 1656, church authorities moved almost in concert, though each within their own jurisdiction and for their own reasons. On the 3rd of January 1656, the Bishop of Namur issued a formal condemnation of the book. Namur was a small see in the southern Netherlands, but episcopal condemnations did not stay local. They circulated, they were copied, they were cited by others who wanted to show that a work stood outside acceptable doctrine. To have a bishop's name attached to an explicit censure marked Prae-Adamitae as something more than a curious speculation. It had become, in the eyes of at least one prelate, a danger to faith and morals. In Paris, the reaction was even more visible. The Parliament of Paris, which was not a parliament in the modern sense, but a high court with both judicial and quasi-censorial powers, took aim at the book. In 1656, it ordered Prae-Adamitae condemned and publicly burned. That act of burning was not just about destroying copies. It was a way of staging orthodoxy. To throw a printed volume into the flames under judicial order was to say that its arguments did not merely err, but transgressed boundaries that the court considered essential to the peace of the realm and the unity of the Church in France. For a work that had been printed quietly in Amsterdam, this was a kind of dark arrival. It meant that the book's existence could no longer be handled as a private problem among scholars. It had entered the world of public scandal. At roughly the same time, La Peyrere's own position became untenable. The veil of anonymity was thin. Those who moved in the same intellectual circles knew who had written Prae-Adamitae, and ecclesiastical authorities were not far behind. In February 1656, in Brussels, he was arrested by order of the Grand Vicar of the Archbishop of Mechelen. This detail matters. The initiative came from the archiepiscopal administration in the Spanish Netherlands, not from French royal officials, and not from the institutions we usually group loosely under the name the Inquisition. There was no Roman tribunal operating in Paris in this story, and the arrest did not take place on French soil. La Peyrère was held for about 6 months. The sources are not rich in personal detail about this period, and we have to imagine the months, mostly in silence, as a long pause in which a man who had written boldly about the deep past now faced the more immediate pressures of ecclesiastical discipline. What we do know is that during this time he moved step by step toward formal renunciation. He abjured his views at Brussels in 1656, with documentation placing acts of abjuration in both June and August of that year. The repetition is significant. An abjuration was not a casual statement, it was a solemn recorded act. To renew it was to underline, for the record, that the author of Prae-Adamitae was not merely recanting under duress, but was willing to affirm that recantation in a more extended process. After Brussels came Rome. On the 12th of February 1657, Pope Alexander VII received La Peyrère. By then, the case was not obscure. The author of a book that had been condemned in multiple places, whose volumes had been burned in Paris, was now being handled at the highest level of the Roman Church. Audience with the Pope did not mean approval of his past ideas. It was part of a process by which someone who had strayed could be publicly reintegrated, or at least neutralized as a source of fresh controversy. The following month, the pattern of formal renunciation continued. On the 11th of March 1657, in St. Peter's, La Peyrère once again abjured, this time in the most symbolically charged space of Latin Christendom, and in the presence of cardinals. Barberini and Albizzi are named in the record as witnessing this act. Their presence anchored the event in the visible hierarchy of the Church. This was no private, whispered reconciliation. It was a staged moment in which the positions laid out in Prae-Adamitae were officially disowned by the man who had written them. Some accounts add a lighter note at this stage, telling an anecdote in which the Pope, or someone in his circle, jokes that a man who had believed in humans before Adam ought now to be reborn after Peter. That line has circulated widely, often as a neat way of closing the story, but it is best treated as an anecdote, not as a securely documented quotation. It captures the flavour of how later storytellers wanted to remember the episode, not necessarily the exact words spoken in 1657. What is solidly attested is La Peyrére's move across a confessional boundary. He had been formed in Calvinist surroundings, moving in Reformed networks even as he navigated Catholic courts. In the years after his abjurations, he entered the Roman fold more fully. In 1659 he joined the Oratory, an institution within Catholicism that prized learning and spiritual discipline. The man who had once argued that Scripture contained traces of humanity before Adam now lived out his remaining years within an order founded to deepen Catholic piety and study. The doctrines he had printed in Amsterdam did not disappear, and they would be read and discussed long after his death. But the official story of Isaac La Peyrère, as recorded by bishops, courts, and cardinals, closes with the images of burning books, signed abjurations, and a quiet conversion sealed within the structures of the Church he had so dramatically provoked. By the time we reach the end of this path, the title that brought us here looks a little different. The forbidden chapter cut from Genesis turns out not to be a single missing page ripped from an original perfect scroll, but a cluster of smaller, stranger facts. There are real places where the text seems to presuppose more than it explains. There are real moments where scribes tell us they adjusted a phrase. There is at least one 17th century book that was actually thrown into real fire. Yet none of this adds up to a neat lost chapter waiting to be snapped back into place. What we have instead is a series of edges, seams, and scars that remind us the Bible is both literature and artifact, layered and handled over time. If we gather the threads very loosely, they form a modest pattern. There is the odd compressed paragraph of Genesis 6, with its sons of God and mighty men of old, which even cautious commentators admit looks like the torso of something longer. There is the solemn formulaic language of Genesis genealogies, and the way some scholars, like Gunkel and Westermann, suggest that this paragraph sits in that list like a fragment grafted in from another tradition. There is Deuteronomy 32:8, standing quietly in the middle of a poetic song, yet carrying three different readings in three major textual witnesses, one of which seems to assume a larger divine assembly than later theology was comfortable naming explicitly. There is the small dossier of Tiqqune Sopherim, those scribal corrections preserved in Jewish tradition, which do not prove large-scale rewriting, but do show an awareness that certain phrases, as written, needed softening. There is the simple fact that Genesis is composite, with stylistic and thematic layers that look like the product of more than one hand and more than one period, even if the exact history of that composition is debated. And there is Isaac Le Peyrère, whose attempt to fill the narrative gaps with pre-Adamite peoples did not alter Genesis itself, but did leave a trace in the history of reception, in the condemnations, the burnings, and the abjurations that followed. When put together, these strands do not reveal a conspiracy of suppression. They do not authorize a confident reconstruction of a missing chapter about another world, fully populated before Adam, then later excised by nervous editors. What they give us is narrower, and in its own way more demanding. They confront us with a text that bears signs of growth, of disagreement among its transmitters, and of readers across centuries trying to make sense of what it does and does not describe. They ask us to live with a record that has fissures rather than a clean edge, where a lost piece can be imagined and then reinserted. For many listeners, that narrower story may feel at first like a disappointment. It does not give the satisfaction of uncovering a suppressed secret. It does not let us say that we know what was really there before later redactors cut it out. Yet, there is a different kind of interest in accepting the limits of what the evidence can sustain. When we stop trying to bend every textual oddity into confirmation of a single cinematic theory, we are free to notice the quieter textures. The repeated little plural in "let us make," the unintroduced people whom Cain fears, the city that appears in a landscape that, if read straightforwardly, should have very few inhabitants. Each of these details becomes an invitation to reflect, not a ticket to a solved mystery. The same is true for the scribal changes. The Tiqqune Sopherim list is short. It does not map onto the modern imagination of ruthless censorship. Instead, it shows forms of reverent discomfort, tiny adjustments aimed at speaking about God with what those scribes considered proper restraint. This is less dramatic than a story of whole chapters thrown out, but it is more instructive. It shows us that transmission was not mechanical. It involved judgment, caution, and sometimes second thoughts. Recognizing this does not destroy the text's authority for those who grant it authority. It simply locates that authority in a history that is more human, and therefore more complex, than a myth of untouchable perfection. La Peyrére's fate adds another layer. His theory that other humans walked the earth before Adam was not a hidden original that the Church suppressed. It was a 17th century attempt to reconcile Scripture with observation and with certain readings of Paul. It was printed, debated, condemned, burned, and finally recanted, not because it exposed a literal missing chapter, but because it pressured the doctrinal frameworks of the time. Remembering that history helps keep our sense of censorship and correction anchored in specific contexts rather than floating free as general accusations. In the end, the more modest conclusion is also the more durable one. No chapter was literally cut from Genesis that we can now recover and read aloud. Instead, we have a canonical text whose own tensions, silences, and abrupt transitions point to earlier materials and parallel traditions we can only partly reconstruct. We have variants that suggest alternative wordings, not alternative worlds. We have later readers, both ancient and early modern, who tried to solve the puzzles and sometimes paid a price for the solutions they proposed. That is not a closed, finished story. It is an ongoing conversation marked by uncertainty at almost every step. Living with that uncertainty can be oddly restful. It allows the questions to remain questions. Were there other people in the author's imagination when Cain spoke of those who might kill him? Did the earliest form of Deuteronomy 32 picture a council of divine beings more vividly than the Masoretic text now allows us to see? Did some community once tell a longer story behind Genesis 6 that has left only this dense remnant? The honest answer, if we stay close to the evidence, is that we do not know. We can propose, compare, and weigh, but we cannot resolve these matters in the way a lost and found chapter would seem to promise. If you have listened this far, you have already chosen to sit with that kind of unresolved space. That may be the most valuable thing to carry away from this episode. Not a new certainty, but a slightly different posture toward old texts, one that is patient with gaps, attentive to small details, and cautious about large claims. If that way of moving through these questions is something you would like to hear more of, it would help a great deal if you would like this video, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Those simple actions tell the recommendation systems that there is an audience for slow, careful work. If you feel like sharing a little more, you might mention in the comments where you're listening from. Part of the quiet pleasure of making episodes like this is imagining the scattered places in which they are heard, the different backgrounds and traditions that listeners bring when they approach the same ancient lines. And if you want to support the channel in a way that also fits into your own rhythms, the best way to do that right now is to listen on Spotify. There is a link in the description. However you choose to continue with more episodes or simply with your own thoughts, the invitation is the same. To let the text be as complex and unfinished as it really is, and to let that complexity be enough.